Good evening, everyone. If you've not had the pleasure of meeting me, my name is Bill Pearson. I'm the Master at New College. A role I serve in with my beautiful wife, Ruth, who's sitting down the front here. Ruth means friendly. She's certainly friendly. Please say hello to her. Warm welcome, especially if you're joining us here for the first time. We had a terrific time together last night. We will release recorded versions of the lectures over the coming few days. The Reverend Dr. Robert Doyle took me aside and asked for podcasts. We're presently looking into that, but certainly the video streams will be available. Let me begin by respectfully acknowledging the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting takes place, and to all Indigenous elders past and present. I've acknowledged on the first night our distinguished guests at our lectures this year. I again wish to acknowledge my fellow trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead and Emeritus Professor David Cohen. The New College team have done a fantastic job of organising the lectures and making these lectures a reality. You will not meet or see any of them, but be assured I'll be thanking them after the lectures are over. And of course, special thanks to Dr. Danny Scarrett and the Reverend Dr. AJ Culp, who have coordinated our lectures this year. I wish to acknowledge the New College Board and especially Mrs. Janet Simpson, who's my board chair. For some people, the third night might be their first time at New College or viewing us via live stream. As a brief introduction, our college communities consist of the present residents of this building, approximately 250 undergraduate students at the University of New South Wales. This original New College has a 54-year history and an outstanding academic track record here. Across the road, we have our postgraduate college, New College Postgraduate Village. 315 youngish people live over there. Again, our college is having a remarkable track record. We have, am I dropping out here? And we have approximately 7,000 alumni who have been student residents here in our colleges. We're affiliated with UNSW. We're also part of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. We hold these lectures as a community service. We have a bookstall out the back, but I draw attention to our small research group, the Centre for Christian Apologetics, Scholarship and Education. We publish quarterly, and there are subscriptions available at 50% during the course of the lectures. Many other excellent books, and again I promote this magnum opus of our lecturer, Biblical Critical Theory. There are copies of that available on the bookstall, as well as many other excellent books. Questions are a wonderful part of the New College lectures, so if you direct your eyes over to your left, my right, and appearing on the screen at the moment, but it won't appear there all the time, but questions can be directed to the URL that's on your screen at the moment, or you can scan that QR code, and in there's a communications piece in which you can type your questions. An anonymous team up the back are curating those questions, putting questions together that are quite similar. And as you will have seen over the last couple of nights, we actually generate a very efficient question time through that. There were a couple of comments that at times people couldn't hear Chris or me during the course of last night's lectures. So if you're in the room here with us and you can't hear for some reason, just put your hand up and the team will see you put your hand up and they'll look into things. If you're online, just send something to the question thing saying, I'm having trouble hearing, and we'll get onto it via that route. The University of New South Wales is encouraging support for needy students. If you'd like to support our scholarship programs here at the colleges, we would love that. There are details that will appear on the screen. Fire alarms, you go out to my left, your right, out the back of the building, bathrooms, corridor. I've disappeared, haven't I? Along this corridor to my right here. Briefly about our lecturer, Associate Professor Christopher Watkin is a future fellow of the Australian Research Council, the peak research granting body here in Australia. His present fellowship is a distinguished and greatly sought after role for academics. Chris is at Monash University and the Monash Data Futures Institute. He specialises in European literature, theology, film and thought, as well as English and American literature. He has active ongoing research interests in the themes of religion, atheism and the secular in philosophy and literature, in themes of liberation and emancipation across culture, and in philosophical understandings of the human being. He's the author of 7 books, his most recent being Biblical Critical Theory, launched here in Sydney at New College Postgraduate Village last year. Just recapping very briefly, night 1, Chris coached us on the core elements of critical theories: viability, visibility and value. He then presented tensions between 2 major streams of contemporary views of society. He highlighted the strong references to biblical Christianity in these views, as well as broader critical theories. And then he argued that the stereoscopic view of the Bible brings a proper perspective, focus and understanding to both people and society. Last night, Chris looked at the question of identity, tracing the construction of 3 dominant modern approaches which have their roots in Descartes, Augustine and the Renaissance. He contrasted these approaches with an account of identity drawn from the Bible, noting that the end of the story is foundational to questions of identity. Tonight, we, sadly, reach the end of our New College stories. I await Chris's words with anticipation. Before I invite him up, if you don't mind, I'm going to pray for us. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet here again this evening, we thank you for the freedom that we have in this country, Australia, to discuss matters of belief and faith without fear. We ask now for your blessing upon our lecturer this evening. Please grant him clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you, a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Please join me in inviting Professor Watkin to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Bill, for your very warm words of welcome. And thank you, everybody, both in the room and listening online, watching online, for giving up your precious time again to be here. It's a joy for me to be able to interact with you over these issues that I think are really important. And it is an honour that you've chosen to come here, and I hope to be able to offer some thoughts that will be fruitful and encouraging for you. Make it worthwhile that you have chosen to come here this evening. 2 nights ago, we thought about human origins, different stories of where we came from, and the way in which our sense of human origin shapes our view of ourselves and our society and what is possible to achieve as a society. Last night, we were considering one of the key questions that animates contemporary late modern cultures, the question, who am I? And today we turn our eyes squarely to the future. I want to think together with you this evening about hope and about destiny, what we can expect in the future. I'm just going to keep talking if this cuts out, and if you want to change anything, then you come and let me know. It is, in important ways, the question. It's the only question that matters. Because until you know how a story ends, you don't really know what sort of story you're dealing with, do you? Think, for example, of those wonderful Agatha Christie novels where Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple get everyone into the drawing room in the final chapter and with a flourish reveal who it was who was the murderer all along. It was Mrs. McGillicuddy who was poisoning everybody's tea and nobody realized it. And then as you look back in the story, you can see that there were clues all along. How did I not see that it was Mrs. McGillicuddy? How could I have been so blind? I thought she was a wonderful old lady. No, she was the fiend. She was the horror all along. And because of the very final chapter, your view of Mrs. McGillicuddy is transformed for good. Or think of the end of the film Return of the Jedi. Do you remember where Darth Vader throws the Emperor down that garbage chute or whatever it is? This is not a spoiler, is it? Because quite frankly, if this is a spoiler, then shame on you. What have you been doing for the last 30 years? But it changes, I think, subtly our view of the development of that character, of the Darth Vader character arc. It transforms him into something of a tragic figure, or at least gives him the shadow of a tragic figure. Or think, for example, of the way, in a real world tragic way, that the abuse scandals that have been revealed in certain Christian ministries in recent years are not just sort of a final chapter for those ministers who have been revealed to be abusive in different ways, but they cover a whole sense of their ministries, of their back catalogue, if you like. The way that their stories ended, sometimes very close to their death, sometimes even after their death, cast a shadow over the whole of those stories. So how something ends is not simply a footnote. It does give a shape to the whole. And therefore, Aristotle, I think, is right in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he quotes Solon, who says, "Think of no person that they were happy until they are dead." Because you don't. You know how the story ends, you can't judge it. Think of no person that they were happy until they're dead. Or think of conversations talk about their futures as well. Think of the Rome as the eternal city. Well, how's that going? And think of the 1,000-year Reich that the National Socialists were proclaiming. How did that end? Until you know how and when something ends, you don't know what sort of story it is. And this is perhaps nowhere more poignantly brought out, at least as far as I know, than in a poem by Shelley. It's a poem that many of us will know. I think it actually featured in an episode of Breaking Bad at one point. It's the poem Ozymandias. And it talks about the great hopes that civilizations or rulers can have for the future and how that often plays out. Let me just read you this poem because I think it brings home the emotional stakes of the way we project into the future. And I don't want this lecture just to be conceptual. I want us to feel what is at stake here, as well as simply thinking through the issues. And I think us to do that. So, Shelley's Ozymandias. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions red, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There's a terrible irony, isn't there, at the heart of that poem. Look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair. Ozymandias is thinking, look how great I am. Despair at my power. You cannot stand against me. But of course, what Shelley is showing is that the despair is at the ruin of human ambition. Look at what Ozymandias has become, these two stone stumps of a leg, his statue toppled over in the desert. Look at what human vanity, look at what human ambition, look at what human hopes for the future come crumbling down to. That is what we should despair at. So tonight we're thinking about stories we tell ourselves about the future. What can we hope for? What can we look forward to? And we moderns, as a society, are particularly exercised about the future. The very term modern, from the Latin modo, right now, suggests that we orient ourselves in time in a peculiar way. Many societies, historically speaking, have found their place in the world by looking up and looking down, looking up to the gods, looking down to the underworld. That's how we know who we are. But not us. We look forward and back. What have we escaped from? What have we developed out of? And where are we heading as a society? What can we look forward to? What progress are we making? And therefore, this question of the future is particularly pertinent for us because it shapes our sense as moderns of who we are. I want to present and offer for your reflection three main stories that we tell ourselves, we moderns, about the future. And the first one is the story of incremental progress. It's an Enlightenment story by and large, and it's the idea that over time, human beings, particularly enlightened human beings, are improving our quality of life. And in the Enlightenment, the way that this was often articulated, with no hint of irony, was that we are moving towards perfection. And given time, we will indeed perfect ourselves. Humans are perfectible, and we are on our way to doing that because now we have reason. We've left superstition behind. I want to read you one quote that sums up this spirit of the possibility of incremental progress, because I think it's hard for us in our position to feel the sense of optimism that it can engender. It's a quote from the French 18th century economist A.J.A. Turgot, and he writes the following. He says, "Manners are softened, the human mind becomes more enlightened, and separate nations are brought closer to one another. Finally, commercial and political ties unite all parts of the globe, and the whole human race, through alternate periods of rest and unrest, of weal and woe, goes on advancing, although at a slow pace, toward greater perfection." And so, in the modern age, philosophers have come one after another to explain how we are getting better and how we're moving towards perfection. So, for example, Auguste Comte in the 19th century said, we started off with a religious age. Oh dear, those were the Dark Ages. We used to believe in gods. And then we moved to a sort of intermediate metaphysical stage. We didn't believe in old men in the sky anymore, but we still believed in transcendent things, and that wasn't really optimal. But now we are arriving, and it's always we arriving, isn't it? We're always at the apex of these things. We are now arriving at the positive age, where we're not worried about these big metaphysical questions anymore. We're just wanting to know how things work and how we can improve society. I'll think about Hegel and his labyrinthine idea of how history works with these dialectical movements that nobody really understands. If anyone ever says that they don't believe them, Hegel is impossibly difficult to understand. But one thing that does seem to emerge from his writing is that, lo and behold, 19th century Germany, who would have thought it, is the pinnacle of human achievement, and everything has been building up to this moment, and now we've finally arrived, and history has sort of reached its climax, and Hegel was there to witness it, and, well, of course, we always like to paint ourselves as the winners, don't we? And the sort of language that comes out of this view of history as incremental progress often takes the form of suggesting that certain ideologies or certain groups are on what is called the right side of history, and other groups are on what is called the wrong side of history. It's a very curious way of speaking, isn't it? It assumes a definite shape to history as such. And I think it's worth reflecting on that, because I think there's something really quite problematic at its core. How would we know whether something or someone or some idea ends up on the right side of history or not? What are the criteria we would need to be fulfilled to make that judgment authoritatively? Well, if we listen to Aristotle, we would need to know the end. We would need to know how history finishes. You don't really know the story, this is Agatha Christie again, until you know the final chapter, how things play out. So how might that happen? Well, one possibility, it's the very live possibility for Christians, isn't it, is that the Lord Jesus comes again. And then history ends that way. And even for those who are not Christians, the most probable way that history is going to end seems to be today something like ecological crisis, and environmental catastrophe, possibly nuclear catastrophe. And in each of those cases, the modern secular West does not come out on the right side of history, because either it's the cause of the environmental crisis, or it's the society that invented the nuclear weapons that destroyed everyone, or it is found to have been mistaken in its secularism. And so the only context in which it would make sense to say that something is on the right side of history would put modern secular modernity on the wrong side of history. And so it is language, I think, that we should use cautiously. It is a very great and bold claim indeed to claim that something is on the right side of history, because history is quite long, isn't it? And some things that appear to be on the right side of history for a while, given time, end up on the wrong side of history. You know, if we looked at sort of length of time as an indicator, Egypt would be on the right side of history. The Egyptian empire lasting for many, many hundreds of years. Rome looked to be on the right side of history for the longest time. And the way in which these societies have risen and fallen, I think, should caution us against using that language too glibly. It is curious, and it evokes pathos from us, I think it should do, that this idea of incremental social progress is often incubated in societies that are doing really quite well, thank you. It's easy to think this way when, for example, we're living in the sort of society we are, when almost always, the only bombs we see falling are on our television screens, when they're not falling around us. It's easy to think that society is developing and progressing. But the brutal reality is that sort of dispensation of peace is very frequently broken and cut across by the barbarity of war and inhumanity. And so you find some of these thinkers who begin saying that we're moving towards perfection, sort of coming up against these events, and then realizing that their philosophy of history was terribly deficient all along. So this happens around the First World War, sort of in the 1920s and 30s. You get this huge wave of optimism. We are getting towards perfection, and then of course that ideology gets buried under 6 feet of mud and mixed with putrefying human flesh in the trenches of the First World War, and the people who held it suddenly are face to face with the bankruptcy of that history, of that way of thinking about history. And they yo-yo. And so you get this theory of societal decline or societal decrepitude that often comes on the coattails of these terrible historical events. And so one huge example of this Oswald Spengler's book, The Decline of the West, published significantly, the first part of it, in 1918, the end of the First World War. There's a sense in these moments that all our wonderful dreams have come crashing down around us, and we're fooling ourselves when we think we're moving towards perfection. Look at what we're capable of doing to each other. Society is one sick joke, and it is fundamentally a story of decline rather than progress. And you get similar narratives today, not quite perhaps as dramatic as that, but there's this narrative today coming from the sort of the Hobbesians that I mentioned 2 nights ago, of a war on the West, or a decline of Western civilization. The West is being unpicked, and all its wonderful sort of victories of democracy and human rights and so forth are under threat. So this declinist vision of society has its ebbs and flows, and there's a sense in which we're in a relatively minor sort of resurgence of that at the moment. So that's our first narrative. Gradual incremental progress, or its inverse image, gradual incremental decline. The second significant narrative of history that circulates in our society is the narrative of transformative, revolutionary change. So the future will not simply be a gradual getting better and better, or gradual getting worse and worse, but what we hope for is a sudden rupture in history, a revolution, in fact, that will upturn society, and then in a very short period of time will transform the conditions of our existence for the better. And in the same way that I wanted to try and help us to feel our way into the gradual incremental progress thesis, I want us to try and walk in the shoes of the revolutionary for a moment. Because unless we do so, I don't think we'll feel what's at stake in looking at history this way. So let me begin with another quotation, this time from Thomas Paine, the American founding father and revolutionary, who expressed, I think, very eloquently in the quotation I'm going to read out in a moment, what it feels like to think that one is on the brink of revolutionary change. Let me read you his words. It's from a pamphlet called Common Sense that he wrote. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months. The reflection is awful in the sense that it inspires awe. And in this point of view, how trifling, how ridiculous do the little paltry cavillings of a few weak or interested men appear when weighed against the business of a world. 2 things to notice from that quotation. First of all, the sense of what theologically expressed is a kairos moment. It is now or never. Now is the time to seize. It's a very striking language, isn't it? Never since Noah, my goodness, has there been such a moment as this. And therefore, the weight, if you like, that is put on this moment, if we were to miss this, if we were to get this wrong, then our name will be besmirched, for eons to come. That history is calling. We must get this right at all costs, or future generations will curse our name. And the second thing from the quotation is how this one overriding, crushing burden of time makes everything else insignificant. This idea of the cavillings of interested men. Nothing matters but this, because it is of such great import and such great moment. And it is not too hard, I think, to see how, if we do walk in those shoes, and if we do let the pressure of seeing the world in that way sit with us for a moment, it is not too hard to see how that can lead a person or a group of people to extreme measures in order to try and secure and bring about this epochal change that is so desperately needed and will be so long-lasting in society. And this is the logic that often overtakes revolutions. It was the logic that overtook the French Revolution. And so I'd just like to read you a quotation from Maximilien Robespierre, who was one of the French revolutionary leaders, from a speech of his very tellingly titled Justification of the Use of Terror. So he is seeing the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution. He sees threats to that revolution, and he sees that the revolution is in the balance. And remember what this means. This means generation after generation after generation of a transformed society is up for grabs if we don't get this right. So what do we need to do? Let me read what he says. If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, its basis in a time of revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is disastrous. Terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than the speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy, applied to the most pressing needs of the country. So why do we execute aristocrats at the guillotine? Not because we want to, not because we've got some petty vendetta against them. We don't enjoy it. It is an expression of virtue. It is what needs to be done in order that this revolution take hold and bring in the wonderful beatific society that generation after generation will thank us for producing. And therefore, to use the words of Joseph Stalin, if you want to make an omelette, you've got to break some eggs. And it is regrettable, and it would be better if it were not the case, but it is. And therefore, we need to do whatever it takes to bring about this revolutionary change. And woe to us if we stop short of using whatever means necessary, including getting rid of the aristocrats. And then, of course, for those of us who know the history of the French Revolution, various other groups in addition, which included Robespierre himself. He was guillotined eventually. But do you see why this is important? I don't want us to dismiss this. I want this to sit with us for a moment. Do you see what's at stake? If you think that upon your decisions hangs the welfare of countless generations to come, and if you get this wrong, there may never be another opportunity. You know, from the time of Noah until now, what would you do? If you really believed that, what would you do? Well, that is the logic of revolutionary social change as expressed by Paine and Robespierre. And those are our first two narratives, incremental social development or incremental social decay, and revolutionary social change. But there's a third narrative that circulates in our society. And it's a narrative that sees precisely the danger that I've just been describing. It sees where revolutionary fervour can lead. It sees where these grand ideas of history can end up, the blood that can sort of congeal around our feet if we're desperate to bring about these dramatic social changes. And it also sees the way in which the idea that we're becoming better and better is often, dashed like a glass vase on the ground when a war or a catastrophe comes along. And so this third narrative doesn't want to frame history in terms of any grand narrative. This third narrative says it's too complex. We don't know. We can't tell. Are we getting better? Perhaps, possibly at times. Are we getting worse? Will revolutionary change bring about what it promises? It is totalitarian to answer that question. So we must refrain from making any grand judgments about history on pain of inflicting violence. And this, by and large, is the narrative adopted by the early Foucault in his writing of history. So Foucault frames the history of the previous centuries in Western countries in terms of a series of what, in the archaeology of knowledge, he calls epistemes. And it essentially means a particular way of looking at the world, a sense of what's going on, a set of categories through which we make sense of the world. And these succeed each other over time, but we would be foolish to say that one of them is better than the previous one, or than the one after it. That one represents progress in relation to another one. Because each one is sort of entire into itself and has its sense of what progress means. And so we would be foolish to sort of try and bring out some grand arc of history, tying them all together. Things change, but we mustn't say that they get better or that they get worse. We must show epistemic humility. We must be willing to admit when we don't know, when things are too complex, and this is one of those cases. So these three major narratives of history that circulate in our society. Let's move now to considering what happens when we bring the Bible into conversation with these narratives. Where does that leave us? The first observation I want to make is that, biblically speaking, it appears that each of these narratives has something that resonates with something in the Bible. So, for example, the Bible does present a picture, a dramatic change in the future, called the resurrection, which seems to resonate with the idea of a dramatic upheaval of society. The first will be last, and so forth. And indeed, many commentators have suggested that Marx is essentially taking this shape of history from the Bible and secularizing it in various complex ways. But the Bible is also very cautious to claim to know exactly what God is doing in any particular events. Think of the Tower of Siloam, for example, in Luke, and how everybody was quick to hypothesize about what this meant historically. These people must be greater sinners than everyone else because the tower fell on them. Jesus says, don't jump to conclusions. Don't think that you can read the providence of God off individual events of history in some sort of straightforwardly transparent way. There is an epistemic humility when it comes to understanding the particularities, the details of history. With the declinist thesis, the Bible is very comfortable with the idea that societies fall as well as rise. Think of the book of Daniel and how time and again the refrain returns in that book that God has these nations in the palm of his hand, and he brings them up and he makes them fall when he wants to. And in relation to the progressive theory of history as well, the sense that there is an overall shape to history, that it isn't a chaos. The Bible similarly resonates with that idea. It doesn't present history as a chaos for us. Which might leave us thinking, well, that's all very middle of the road then. The Bible is saying everybody's got a little bit of right in them. How nice. Let's all be friends. But I think that would be selling the Bible way too short, because I want to try and show, because I believe it to be the case, that the Bible is actually not simply trying to meet in the middle of all these different theories, but it is more level-headed than either the incrementalist or the declinist. That it is more critical than the position that refuses to frame history in terms of a grand narrative. And it is more radical than the revolutionary. Take those one by one. So first of all, more level-headed than the incrementalist or the declinist. Because what those two positions have in common is that they read human progress an index of external circumstances. So are we externally improving the conditions of our lives? We've got cars now we didn't used to. We've got the internet we didn't used to. We've got hospitals we didn't used to. We've got washing machines we didn't used to. Life is good. Humanity is progressing. This is wonderful. Similarly, have we just had a war? Have we just been mindlessly slaughtering each other? Oh, humanity is terrible. But I don't think that, biblically speaking, that index of human progress is profound enough, goes deep enough to the core of who we are. Because as the Lord says when David is choosing a new king, and so when Samuel is choosing a new king and really thinks it ought to be the David's eldest brothers who have got the biggest muscles and look the most fit for the job, God gives David a warning, doesn't he? That people look on the outward appearance, but God, unlike people, looks on the heart. And time again, when God looks at his people and looks at the world, it is people's hearts that concerns him most, not the external conditions of their lives. And our heart, stubbornly, is one of the things that we seem least able to change. Our predisposition to be people who seem inveterately to return to selfishness and self-serving behaviors over time. The human heart is very stubborn, it appears, over the centuries. And therefore, the Bible doesn't get too carried away when conditions of life improve. It is good to have hospitals. The hospitals have been driven, historically speaking, by Christian communities. There's nothing wrong with hospitals. There's nothing wrong with technology improving the conditions of life. But when we think that fundamentally we are progressing in the deepest sense by doing so, I think our diagnosis is too superficial. And that means that the Christian neither gets sort of whisked away in huge sort of utopian dreams when things are going well, as they by and large are in our society at the moment, nor does the bottom fall out of her world when things are going terribly, as they are, as we've been very brutally shown in other parts of the world at the moment, and as they may, who knows, in our part of the world in the future. Because, to use a phrase that's slightly trite in its expression, but I think very profound in its meaning, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. And that has not been transformed over the centuries. And so the Christian has a level-headedness when it comes to understanding how history is developing. The Christian, I think, is also more critical than the sort of Foucauldian position that says there's no narrative to history. We shouldn't impose some sort of totalitarian grid on the way history is going. For the reason that very position has its own dogma. So what would happen if history did turn out to have a shape? Well, it can't, says Foucault. No, there is no shape to history. Yeah, but what if there were? No, there can't be. So there's a dogmatism to that refusal of the possibility of history having a shape that is, in fact, equivalent to the dogmatism of imposing a particular shape on history. But both of those ways of thinking about history have to close their mind to a particular possibility. Either that history has no shape, or that history has a shape. There's a stubborn dogmatism about both of them. But as I understand the Bible, the Christian is skeptical of both those dogmatisms. Because on the one hand, it seems pretty clear that eventually there is a shape to history. When we read the book of Revelation, certain things happen. And history is brought to an end in a particular way. But the way in which we get there is very opaque. Nobody knows when Jesus is coming back. And he makes emphatically sure to tell us, don't think that you know, and don't believe anyone who tells you. It seems that things will get worse towards the end. We don't know exactly how. We don't know when. So there's an opacity to history. And therefore, the Christian, I think, has a very supple and critical, in a good sense, approach to the events that happen around us. And I think this really comes out in times of great suffering and need. I want to read you a quotation from J.R.R. Tolkien, who, among many other things that he did, fought in the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, that disastrous, brutal, inhuman battle in which soldiers went over the top and were just mown down by machine guns, going back and forth, and the machine guns were so hot by the end of it that they melted to themselves because they'd fired so many bullets at these soldiers walking towards them, that brutality of war. And having lived through that, he wrote the following words: "I am a Christian, and indeed a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpse of final victory." And what he's drawing attention to here is the very counterintuitive and very odd shape that history takes for Christians. Because there's a sense in which we're predisposed to think that things will get worse and then get better. Sort of a V-shaped idea of history, a non-linear account of history. And that is, unless there's a God in control of history, that is a very odd position to have. Like, either things are getting better, or things are getting worse, or we don't know what things are happening. But this V shape of history, I think, is really quite distinctively Christian. And it guards the Christian, I think, against the twin pathologies of thinking that history is transparent and we know exactly what's happening, or unmooring ourselves from any narrative of history and foreclosing any possibility of knowing anything about the future, which I think is a paralyzing position to be in. So more level-headed than the incrementalist and the declinist, more critical than the person who denies the grand narrative of history, and thirdly, more radical than the revolutionary. So imagine we could get Karl Marx up on the stage and sort of interview him and ask him the question, okay, Karl, sell us your vision for the future. Give us both barrels. Paint a picture of what you think can be achieved in history. What might he say? Well, he might say something like this. Imagine a society in which all the inveterate hierarchies that have so plagued us and so held us back for centuries are done away with. Hierarchies of wealth, hierarchies of birth, hierarchies that mean that even today it is the people from certain families who can get into the best universities. We might like to pretend we're living in some sort of flat meritocracy, but as Michael Sandel has argued recently, it's not really the case. There are hierarchies in our society that might be different to ancient ones, but they're still there. Imagine all of those gone. Imagine a society in which everyone, regardless of their profession, first of all, has a job, and secondly, has 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest and recreation, and 8 hours of sleep every day. And so, to use Marx's own example, imagine if the labourer can come home and cultivate a passion for the violin each day, or become a cultural critic each day, helping different parts of our personality and ourself to blossom. Imagine a society in which that is the reality for everybody, not just for an aristocratic few. And I don't know about you, but that is a beautiful picture. I would quite like to live in a society where that were the case in and of itself. It sounds really attractive. Now imagine we interrogated the Bible and tried to draw out its picture of the future. And the first thing I said is thank you so much, Karl. It was really enlightening. But how small is your vision of the future. How narrow your ambition for humanity. Let me show you a future in which every tongue, tribe, and nation, all the different societies and cultures of the world are united, praising the Lamb on the throne in Revelation 7, and not losing their cultural distinctiveness, but neither antagonistic towards each other, all united in praise of the one God. Let me show you a society in which there is no longer any sea, and of course the sea was the embodiment for the Israelite society of the first century of chaos. Invasions came from the sea. Chaos came from the sea. So the idea that there's no sea is a complete security, which today, by and large, is a value of the political right, isn't it? Secure our borders, secure our possessions, policing and so forth. But let me also show you how this ultimate fulfillment of the value of security goes hand in hand with the ultimate fulfillment of the value of diversity, with all these tongues, tribes, and nations around the throne. And diversity is, by and large, today, a value of the political left, isn't it? So let me show you a world in which everyone's deepest desires and deepest ambitions are simultaneously fulfilled in a way that's not antagonistic, setting one against the other, playing off one against the other. But the intuitions that animate people across the political spectrum today find an ultimate fulfillment in this society. Let me show you a society where the great enemy behind all enemies, the great enemy of death, has been defeated. Because death is the pin that bursts all our balloons, isn't it? All our great dreams, all our human ambitions, all our relationships are ultimately burst by death. It is the great enemy that lurks behind all the little enemies in our society, and all our great dreams for the future eventually come crashing into the buffers of death. Well, let me show you a society where death is no more, where death actually has been defeated. Let me show you a society where justice is done for the dead. So, 300 years ago, there was an event that took place in a closet, an event of abuse that nobody knew about, nobody knows about to this day. Only the person who was abused and the abuser ever knew about it. And it ruined their life, and they never recovered. And the abuser took it to the grave. Let me show you a world in which that is brought out into the open, where a light is shone upon it, and where that deed is judged by a perfect judge who knows everything, who sees everything, and who judges with perfect justice. And where that abuser will not go free, but will have to pay an account for what they did on that day. Let me show you a society so absolute in its justice that justice is even brought for the dead in this life. Now, show me a political platform today or a revolutionary ideology that is claiming anything like that, anything so outrageously grand as that. And yet that is orthodox, plain, 2,000-year-old Christianity. That is what the Bible claims. That is what Christians hope for in the future. That justice, that triumph over death, that peace, that diversity, that security. How small does Marx's vision seem compared to that? But of course, Marx has an answer, doesn't he, if he was still up here? He would say, well, yes, it's all pie in the sky when you die, isn't it? You believe in these wonderful grand ideas about the future, and therefore you just sit back in the present and you don't care. Because if you think justice is coming, then you don't want to bother about justice happening now. I want to deal with the injustices that are in the world here and now, while you Christians dream about this imaginary future of yours. But I think then the Christian would open the Bible and say, well, let's see if that's how it works. Let's see if that's how the Bible talks about this wonderful promised future. Let's pick indeed one of the chapters in the Bible that is most rhapsodic about this beautiful future. 1 Corinthians 15. You remember, it's the chapter where Paul is taunting death. Death, where is your victory? He says. Death, where is your sting? Sort of blowing raspberries at death. It is a very audacious thing to do, isn't it? Now, I lost my father earlier this year. Death is a brutal, brutal thing. It is not to be treated lightly. It's not to be mocked. And yet Paul finds himself, in a sense, dancing around on death's grave in this chapter, in this outrageously hopeful sort of paean of praise to the idea that, that our bodies that are sown perishable will be raised imperishable. We're sown a physical body, we're raised a spiritual body. These grand theological ideas. How does he finish that chapter? Because I think Marx would say he finishes it with something like, well then, let's sit back, put opium in our pipes and have a good old smoke, because we know that justice is coming, so we can just sit back and let it happen now. Let me read you how Paul does finish that chapter. 1 Corinthians 15:58. So we've had 57 verses of dancing on death's grave and these grand theological ideas. This is how he lands the chapter. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. In other words, get up tomorrow morning, drag a comb across your hair, make your bed, drink some coffee, get out there and do something. Roll your sleeves up, have a go. Labor for the Lord. Give a cup of water to one of the least of these. Why? Because in view of these grand theological ideas, you know, dear Christian brother or sister, that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. You know that when you do give a little glass of water to someone that nobody ever sees, that brings about no geopolitical change in the world, you know that that is not in vain. Because the Lord, who is outside history and who controls history, gives you that guarantee. But that cannot be claimed of any of the other ideologies that we've been discussing this evening. If I'm an incrementalist, I cannot be sure that all the effort and striving that I put into making society better will not be shown eventually to have been in vain. Think of the way, for example, that we judge previous generations. Go back to, say, 500 years. The ways that people then were seeking to reform society, do we necessarily think they were all wonderful? Well done. I think we cringe, don't we, at some of the things people were seeking to do back then. Well, how arrogant it would be of us to think that people 500 years hence will certainly not cringe at what we were seeking to do with society. It would take a lot of historical hubris to be sure that that were not the case. We do not know that our labours are not in vain. And the revolutionary, seeking, striving with every fibre of her being to bring about this wonderful change, that her labour to break these eggs to make the omelette won't end up with some stinking, wretched, sort of festering mess around her feet rather than a beautiful omelette that she's making. Cannot be sure. And to the extent that we let that reality sink into our pores, it deflates these grand visions of the future, the incrementalism and the revolutionary transformation. And only the Christian, not by virtue of their own efforts or their own insight, but only the Christian knows that whatever they do in the Lord will be shown when history ends not to have been in vain. even the littlest action. Jesus uses this example of giving a cup of water to someone. It's trivial. It's not trivial. It's not in vain. So get out there and do it. Get out there and work. It's the opposite of what Marx thinks Christianity pushes you to do, isn't it? He thinks because of this wonderful future, Christians are just sitting there waiting. It's not what the Bible says. It's not a biblical logic. It's an anti-biblical logic, that. And so when all the tears have been shed, when all the effort has been exerted, when all the grand dreams have been dreamed, and when, to be frank, you and I are dead, there remains, because it doesn't depend on us, a glorious picture of a future for God's people that fulfills all of our deepest human longings and aspirations. And therefore the question that remains for all of us, sitting in this room and listening online this evening, is who or what will we trust with our future? Will we trust one of these ideologies that claims to promise incremental progress or revolutionary social transformation? In which case we cannot be sure that our labour will not have been in vain. Or will we trust the God who not only sets forth before us this picture of the future, but actually, if you like, signed it in his own blood, showed his commitment to us by becoming a man and dying on a cross for us, to demonstrate, not just with words, but with actions, that he has our best interests at heart. To whom will we commit our labours? For whom, for which vision of the future will we strive? And so I want to finish with a passage from the end of the Bible. A passage that is both one of the loftiest and grandest visions of the future, but, as I've been trying to show, therefore also one of the most practical and concrete and immediate visions as well. And they're words from Revelation 21. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. Amen.
Let me reiterate, if you wish to ask a question, the URL is on the screen. We have questions flowing in now. The first one comes from Lily. Patterns often repeat throughout history. Cycles of civilization, societal systems of rule. Can these patterns be interrogated to inform perspectives of right or wrong sides of history?
I suspect only to the extent that the human heart remains the same. So if humans fundamentally changed over time, in a radical sense, then it would make no sense to interrogate history. because we'd be dealing with apples and oranges. The people of the past would be so different to us that there would be no lessons to learn. So it's only on the assumption that people in the past are fundamentally like us in the deepest sense. You know, the conditions of life, of course, and the way that they view the world are radically different, but at a heart level, there's a continuity. I think that has to be an assumption in order to discern repeating patterns in history. Otherwise, it is just a chaos. But I don't know that it necessarily means that we can pass authoritative judgment on being on the right or wrong side of history, because these different societies that have risen and fallen have such different ideas of what that would look like. So each society has its own sense of who or what is on the right side of history, and lo and behold, they all put themselves on the right side for their different reasons. And I think that should give us pause when we think of putting ourselves on the right side. Well, that's what the Egyptians did, and that's what the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Romans did, all for their different reasons. And we wouldn't agree with them. So why would we think that we are the ones to have got it right, where everybody else seems to have got it wrong? I think we would have to have a mighty trust in our own judgment.
Thank you. Thank you. From James. How are we going, Chris? From James. Your approach to history seems similar to the one proposed by David Bentley Hart in Tradition and Apocalypse. That is, we need to adopt an apocalyptic stance to history, whereby the ending reveals the arc of history, but only from the viewpoint of the end of it itself. Would that be a fair way to describe your position?
Are we on? I haven't read that particular book, so all I know of it is that description that you've just given. But that seems to be broadly what I'm saying. Yes, that, you know, as Aristotle said, think of no person that they were happy until they're dead. Think of no society in terms of some final judgment on it until you know how it finishes, and don't judge history until you know how it ends. That would seem to resonate with what I'm saying. Yeah.
Great. Chris, do you want me to use that microphone? Push the button on this baby. Good. I can push buttons, as the staff will tell you. Right, from where are we up to? Sorry, start doing stand-up comedy. From Peter. Is there then a place for Christian political activism? And if so, how do you think it might be shaped and expressed?
Absolutely there's a place for that, because we know that our labour in the Lord is not in vain. And the Bible does set forth a vision of what a flourishing society looks like. We were exploring a little bit of that on the first evening. This biblical idea of shalom, a society where all the relationships are woven together in a way that allows individuals and communities in that society to flourish. And I think if people are wanting some reading for this, Nicholas Walterstorff has a couple of books in which he tries to develop this distinctively biblical idea of shalom, or sometimes welfare as it's translated, as a way to think about how to be active in society. And so I think absolutely there's a way to do that. Shalom is one of the windows through which Christians can seek to explore how to try and serve and bless and benefit the society around us in very practical ways.
Thank you. From John. I didn't quite get the idea of the V-shaped history. Would you please explain it again?
Yeah, thank you, John. I don't think I explained that very well. So the secular views tend to be quite linear in that things get better or things get worse, or we do something to change things. So there's a revolution and then it's wonderful. The weirdness of the biblical picture, and this sort of comes out in the book of Revelation, is it seems that as you get close to the end, things get really, really bad. So there's no teleology, no sort of Enlightenment-style teleology to history from a Christian point of view. You can't read how things are going to end off how things are now. And this was Tolkien's point, who'd lived through the First World War. And the V shape is, so if you imagine sort of the y-axis is welfare and things going well, so the higher it is, the better things are going, and then the x-axis is time. Things get worse, so looking at it from your point of view, things get worse, and then they get better at the end. That's the V. That's the V shape. And it's an unusual way to think about history. But it's, I think, a very deeply biblical way.
Thank you. From Kate, when we look back on the European Reformation, is it best considered an incremental change or really a revolution?
Wow. I think it's a... So the dynamic of the Reformation is a sort of it's a retrieval, isn't it? So there's a going back in history in order to go forward, what the Catholics would call a ressourcement, going back to the sources and sort of shedding the accretions that have coagulated around that historical source over time in order to progress. So I think there's a complexity to that movement that's neither simply incremental progress. So we're not starting from where we are and simply getting better. And it's not necessarily a revolutionary change. I think this dynamic of ressourcement, reaching back in order to go forwards, is probably the dynamic that better captures what the Revelation is doing. The Reformation is doing.
Thank you. From Luke, what would you say to the person who thinks that life only has value because it is finite?
Before I say what I think, let's just explore that, because I think it's a very delicate and tender idea, and I think it has an intuitive appeal, doesn't it? So part of the beauty of a flower, the argument would go, is that we know that tomorrow it will wilt, and therefore there's a kairos, there's a moment to appreciating the flower. Its very ephemerality is part of its beauty. If it was, a glass flower eternally there, something would be missing. And therefore this principle is expanded out and say, life is beautiful and worth something precisely because it finishes. This is like the position of the person who thinks that death is the end, and therefore life is all the more precious and tender because of that. As someone who's lost his father in the last year, I find it hard to think myself fully into that position. I think there are moments when we do encounter death as an enemy, where it does rob us of the best things in a way that is not beautiful. My father's death was not beautiful. And so I think there are certain conditions in which that argument has purchase on us and other conditions that show its limits. I think that the Christian response to that is that I think it is onto something, but I don't think it's quite onto the right thing. So it's often called the pathos of finitude. We are worth something because we are finite. And I think the biblical response to it is not simply to dismiss that whole idea, but to slightly tilt it and to reframe it, not as a pathos of finitude, but as a pathos of contingency, in the sense that for the Christian, and I think this is an unusually Christian position, a particularly Christian position. At least David Bentley Hart argues that it is in The Beauty of the Infinite. I agree with him. That this universe did not need to be. God did not create the universe out of necessity. There's nothing in the Bible that suggests he was compelled to do so. It seems from the Bible that he created it out of love as a gift. And therefore we don't have to be here. There's a contingency. And fundamentally, our existence is an expression of love and a gift. Now, if you don't have a God who's outside creation, then it's very hard to break the causal chain and to have the universe as anything other than necessary. And Hart goes into this in great detail in his book. And so I think the Christian would say, yes, there is a pathos, but it isn't the pathos of finitude, because death is an enemy, but it is the pathos of contingency. You and I are sitting here in this room this evening, not because we had to be, not because there's some iron chain of causal necessity and that the world is a closed system in which everything that happens has to happen because nothing comes in from the outside, but because a loving God decided to create the world and actually knew us before the creation of the world. And so there is that pathos. And I think that's what this position is onto. It's onto that pathos. But I think for the Christian, it's not finitude, it's contingency.
Thank you. Nathan asks, do you have any predictions on the next 80 to 100 years of civilization? As hard as it might be to predict the future.
A joker. I'm just trying to think, biblically speaking, what would be the wise thing to say? Well, I think human hearts will continue on pretty much as they are. We will continue to be capable of great and noble acts of self-sacrifice, and we will also continue to be at war with each other in both literal and metaphorical ways. And so the baseline index of human progress, in other words, what are the condition of our hearts, I think will remain relatively stable. As to how the conditions of life will change, about the difference between my generation and the generation of my children. So when I was young, there was sort of an implicit expectation that my life would be better than my parents'. And nobody ever said it, but that was sort of what we assumed. My father's life was better than his father's. My mother's life was, in terms of the conditions of our lives, was better than her mother's. And it had been so as far back as any of us know in the family. I don't think that's the case anymore. I get the sense that young people, and people can correct me, I'm very happy to be corrected on this, but I get the sense that there's a growing feeling today that life for people who are now in their teens will most probably be worse than for their parents. There's house prices that are part of that. There's ecological issues, climate crisis, so forth. And that is a very different world to live in, regardless of whether that's true or not, and none of us know for certain. To feel that, it's a very different world to grow up in, to the world that I grew up in, thinking that by and large I was likely to be better off than my parents are. So I guess what I'm saying is there are two things. There's what will actually happen, and none of us know. But there's what we feel will happen, which in a sense is just as important because it conditions our approach to life and our sense of the possibilities of our own existence and mental health and so on and so forth. And I think that has shifted. And I think my children's generation don't have the confidence that I had, that their lives will by and large be better than the lives of their parents. And that is to weep over. That is a very heavy burden to go through life feeling, I think.
Thank you. From Andrew, you have made note of how the Christian promise of the future is more radical than any political platform. What separates this promise from any similarly radical promises made by other religions?
I'm going to have to disappoint the questioner ultimately, because as I said in response to a question that was asked on the first night, I think, I'm just no expert in world religions. And therefore to pontificate from a platform like this as if I were, I think would be crass of me. I'm not aware, so I can put it in this way, I'm not aware of, and they're, again, very happy to be contradicted, I'm not aware of any other world religions that have the same radical non-linearity that Christianity does. So it's a convoluted word to describe, I think, a beautiful reality. And it's the reality of Mary's song, the Magnificat. Do you remember when she's thinking about the future and she talks about how the humble will be lifted up and the rich will be sent empty away? That there's an upturning, there's an overturning of the hierarchies that characterize our world today that we have to look forward to in the future. And I think that the more we think about that, the more I think about that, I should say, the more attractive that seems, because this world is unjust and its hierarchies are brutal. And we are, by and large, globally speaking, on the top side of these hierarchies living in Australia. And so it's perhaps harder for us to feel than some who are living in countries where that is not the case. But there are odious hierarchies. And the sense that there will be a fundamental overturning of those, that the first will be last and the last will be first, is both very confronting, because in many ways we are the first in this world, aren't we? I mean, look at us. Look at our clothes, look at our homes, look at what we are able to do with our time. So it's confronting for us, but I think it's also just so fundamentally healthy as a way to think about the world. Don't be fooled. Don't look out into the world and be fooled by those who are making it, those who have got everything going for them in this life. Because as Mary so deliciously prophesies, these hierarchies will be overturned. And I think that vision of the future is not something that I see necessarily replicated in the religions that I am somewhat familiar with. But as I say, I claim no sort of deep familiarity with other religious traditions.
Thank you. From Eleanor, if the Bible is level-headed, critical, and radical at the same time, is it helpful for church leaders to publicly communicate or even encourage a certain stance on political issues?
It's a very broad question, isn't it? And it's hard simply to say yes or no, I think, because different contexts may demand different things of different ministers into different church congregations. So I don't want to just say yes or no, but I don't want to say, oh, because it's complicated, I can't say anything either, because that's equally unsatisfactory. I'm thinking of Paul's commands to Timothy. So the closest we've got to a sort of training manual for preachers in the Bible is what Paul says to Timothy. And it seems to be, in that case, that the overwhelming charge is to preach the word, to explain the Bible to people. But not just explain, that sells it short, doesn't it? It sounds like a lecture. To preach the word, to enjoin, to encourage, to minister the word to people. And it doesn't seem that Paul is particularly exercised about the political questions of the day, at least in what's written to Timothy. And so I think that should perhaps give us pause. And the danger of folding our particular politics into the preaching of the word, I guess, is the same danger that was committed by some of the early missionaries to Africa and other places, where the idea that was, well, yes, you need to become Christian, but you also need to become Western, you see. You've got to dress like us to be real Christians. You've got to have manners like us to be real Christians. And therefore the gospel gets all sort of barnacled with a particular cultural or civilizational position, and it puts a stumbling block in people's paths, because you don't need to become Western to be Christian, thank goodness. And so to suggest to people, either implicitly or explicitly, that you do, is putting a burden on people that they ought not to be wearing. And to the extent that if politics is preached from the pulpit, party politics, it becomes harder for people to distinguish the message of salvation in Christ from a particular political position, And people think, well, in order to be a proper Christian, I need to be that sort of political person. I need to take that party political platform as my own. I think we similarly run the risk of putting a stumbling block in people's paths that we ought not to do. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Christians need to be, sort of weirdly neutral on all political issues. It's a question, I think, in the terms that it was put, of what is preached from the pulpit. And I'm sure that even the preachers who refrain from giving their own political opinions in the pulpit have political opinions. Not that one can't have opinions. It's the danger of so bundling those with the gospel message that you give the impression you can't be a Christian unless you believe this, and this politically, which I think is incredibly dangerous.
Thank you. Joe asks, can you comment on the argument that Western civilization has delivered great good due to the influence of Christianity, and therefore it is obviously wrong for the Christian to agree with woke discourses that undermine Christian influence?
This is an argument that's been put really powerfully, I think, in a couple of instances recently. So some of us in the room and online will be familiar with Tom Holland's book, Dominion. It's a big, thick book. Nothing wrong with big, thick books, by the way. This is a big, thick one. And he makes this argument, and he actually goes a little bit further than that, and he says both sides of today's culture wars are sinking their roots deep in Christian ideas. And at one point in that book, I think sort of 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, he says the culture wars today are putting one set of Christian values against another set of Christian values. So he would see what goes under the name of woke culture as one expression of values that have their origin in a Christian context. To the extent that not all societies historically have thought that equality, for example, is a good thing. That needs explaining. Why is that a thing for us? Why is human dignity, human rights a thing for us? That's not obvious. Like, there's lots of societies, ancient and modern, that don't think in that way. But the other side of the culture wars as well, he would argue, sets down deep roots in Christian soil. And then Glenn Scrivener's book, The Air We Breathe, makes a similar sort of argument. And so I don't think... So first of all, I don't think that Christianity fits like a hand in a glove in either side of that culture war, absolutely, to the exclusion of the other side. I think both of those positions can be seen to have been drawn out of distinctively Christian values. And that's the argument that Tom Holland is making. But I think the argument that needs to go alongside that, and I'm not sure that Holland is quite as sharp on this, is that the way in which those ideals and values function in the ecosystem of Christianity, in a biblical ecosystem, the way in which they rely on each other, and like the different species in a habitat all sort of coexist and rely on the sort of baseline conditions of that habitat. If you take those ideas out of that biblical ecosystem and try and make them survive isolated from that context, you often end up with quite different things to how they appear in a Christian context. So, for example, the sense of equality that emerges from a biblical view of things, which relies on, for example, the creator-creature distinction and only God being outside creation and everything being made by him, to name one condition of biblical equality. If you don't have that framework, there has to be some other foundation for equality. So these values have the same name, so human dignity or freedom or equality and so forth, but they're never quite the same thing when they're excised from their biblical context. And so what we, and the we can be a left we or a right we, what we call security or freedom or equality is never quite how the Bible would frame it. And I think it's important to take account of that, as well as taking account of the fact that these ideas were birthed in society in a Christian context and come out of Christian thinking. And if we hold both of those together, I think we can address the debates that are going on in society in a way that doesn't shoehorn Christianity into one side to the exclusion of another. So neither Christianity is utterly and exclusively and exhaustively anti-woke, or, as some will argue, Christianity is utterly and exhaustively and exclusively woke. Those categories are too small. They're too emaciated to contain the complexity of Christianity. And I think, therefore, I'd hesitate to sort of pin Christianity to either of those positions in the way that they're presented in society.
Great. Thank you. There are 2 questions, 1 comment, and that's it. Question 1 from Lewis. Would you say that the V of the Christian view of history is the analogue of the sufferings and glories of the Christ, that we are promised to be the character of the individual Christian life? I think you've got the sense. I haven't read it very well.
Look, it does seem to be so, doesn't it? I think it's a really interesting observation. So, Philippians 2 is that same V shape, isn't it? Christ did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very form of a servant. And then you get to the lower point of the V, in that passage where Christ dies a death on a cross. And then, and I didn't notice this until I did the research for the book, but this is really interesting. The pronouns change, the actor changes. So Christ humbles himself, but he doesn't exalt himself, interestingly, in that passage. God exalts him. So the upward part of the V is a change of agency and a change of trajectory. And then, Christ at the end of that passage receives the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So there's this moment of great exaltation. So there is, as you very rightly say, that same V shape to the trajectory of first the cross and then the crown. And history seems to take a similar shape for Christians. I think the questioner is onto something there.
Our last question comes from Ed. Given that we know the end, and we know therefore how rightly to live now in the light of the end, can we evaluate the current state, not the trajectory, by its conformity to the state that we will enter at the end?
As I was trying to argue the first night, there is a sense of the end does yield what Theodore Adorno calls a standpoint of redemption. So we see what society looks like when it is working well. We see what shalom, the ultimate sort of embodiment of shalom in the new heavens and the new earth, is. And therefore, we've got a sense that's not simply bootstrapping itself out of the status quo, of where the status quo is deficient in relation to this vision of the end. And so I think I would go harder than the questioner suggests. And I would say that not only can we, but only on the basis of a position like Christianity, where there is this rupture and where the status quo isn't simply the gradual outworking of pre-existing conditions without any qualitative rupture. Only with such a qualitative rupture, like Christian eschatology, like the nonlinear V, can we say of society at the moment that this thing is unjust in it, and mean by that anything more than I have negative feelings towards it, or I don't like it, or I intuit that it is objectionable. And therefore the full-bodied, meaningful cultural critique, and perhaps this is a nice way to end, isn't it, relies on the sort of view of the world. Critical theory relies on the sort of view of the world that the Bible presents to us, and is extremely hard to draw out of a view of the world that doesn't have these ruptures that the Bible presents to us. And I think the history of critical theories over the past decades bears that out in many ways. I think that is what the later Derrida struggles with. He has this sense of justice, but it's very hard to grasp exactly what he means, and it's problematic in a number of different ways. And I think Foucault struggled with this. Foucault scholarship still struggles with this. Like, does he have norms or not? And people will disagree about this. So this is a really live question for different critical theorists, but I think the Bible can bring a healing word to that struggle. And it is a struggle, because no one wants to say the Holocaust was just a thing that happened, like every other thing. Especially the generation of people who were writing in the 1960s and 70s. You can't, like, nobody's okay with that. And yet, on what basis can you say that it was unjust with an authority that means more than I don't like it, or I'm on the side that doesn't like it? It may seem that it's really easy to do that, but philosophically it's really quite hard to do that. And the Bible provides this standpoint of redemption from which we can say that was evil, that was wrong, that was unjust. And it's very hard to see how you can say that with the same weight of meaning if you don't have a framework such as the one the Bible provides.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to allow you to step down for a moment. I'll take the microphone. We'll invite you back up in a moment. I'll just read the comment that's on the screen, which says, Pranambi, thanks so much for your lectures this week. We've really loved tuning into them from Canberra, so it's coming in from Canberra. For the present, though, I'd like to invite the Dean of Studies here at New College, AJ Culp, to come and move a vote of thanks. Thanks, AJ.
Am I using this one? Yeah.
I think you can use this as I was doing. Whatever you like.
Okay. So many microphones. I would like to say something not just about tonight, but about this book as a whole, this work as a whole, which I think is quite significant. But the difficulty is I have to confess, I find myself a bit at a loss for words, not because there's so little to say, but because there's so much that's already been said. It's been said by people here in this very hall over the last 2 nights. We've heard the words of Professor Emeritus David Cohen, and we've heard the words of the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney. Here in Australia, we've heard the decision of the Committee for the Sparklet Australian Christian Book of the Year Award, which has named a biblical critical theory as the Christian Book of the Year. And internationally, among theological and cultural thought leaders, if you have been listening or know where to look to listen, there's been a cacophony of praise and of discussion that Chris's book has generated. And all of this is wonderful and well-deserved. But personally and selfishly, it leaves tonight's giver of thanks in a bit of a pickle. The question is, how does one offer something meaningful to this cacophony of thanksgiving that's already ongoing? Or for anyone who's survived their childhood, you'll recognize this as a grown-up version of something familiar: how not to be the kid who brings carrot sticks to an ice cream party. It seems to me that the only way for me to do this tonight, to share something meaningful, that is to share something somewhat personal with my journey with Chris's work. And so I'd like to say this: when I accepted the role here as Dean of Studies, I did so, and I learned that Chris's book would be the subject of our lectures. And I was very excited. It had already been on my list of something to read, and I used this as an opportunity to read it in full. And so I committed to reading it from cover to cover. But there were a few obstacles here. The first was the small matter of packing up our life in the U.S., moving some 14,935 kilometers, if Google is to be believed, and beginning a new life here in Sydney. The next was the small matter, that's right, kilometers, that's cultural. I was going to say 10,000 miles, but I wanted to be, culturally sensitive. Anyway, so the next was the small matter of finding my feet in an entirely new role in an entirely new city. And the final obstacle, of course, is helping my children, when I return from my new role, find their feet in this new city as well. And all tallied, as any parent who has done an international move will know, this didn't leave a lot of time, which is an understatement. I soon realized that my only time to read was on my daily commute. And this daily commute came by way of Sydney public buses. I don't know if any of you have ridden them, but should be self-explanatory, but let me go on. Anyways, a small problem with this, especially for me, is that since childhood I've been afflicted with motion sickness. And see, I can tell here who doesn't have motion sickness because he wouldn't have laughed. Anyways, in all honesty, I never dreamt of trying to do something so audacious and reckless as reading on a written page on a moving vehicle in my life. But I had committed to read Chris's book, and I only had a few months to do it. And so, morning and evening, I read, day after day, starting and stopping, twisting and turning, amidst the mayhem that is Sydney buses. I read, I underlined, I took notes. I'm not going to lie to you, there were many moments of doubt, many moments of concern, many moments of near disaster, if you know what I mean. But I did read. And I suspect, to be honest, that there were many a student who were looking out their window who wondered why the new dean would arrive each morning looking pale and a little tipsy. But as I stand before you, I can say in good conscience that I did read it from cover to cover. All 605 pages, and that is exactly how many there are. And I can say as well, and this is really the important part, Chris, that it was worth it, that it was genuinely worth it, that it is a work that will shape my own thinking, my own teaching, my own writing. And so as we come to the conclusion of our lectures, I wanted to just say two very, very brief thank yous. First of all, thank you for writing a work that is worthwhile. Genuinely, thank you. And thank you, secondly, and I believe this will be the only time you hear these words in this order, thank you, secondly, for writing only 605 pages. I genuinely could not have done another page more. Thank you, Chris.
Well, thank you for your patience, ladies and gentlemen. We just have a couple of more formalities to fulfil before we conclude the evening. You may wonder why I'm carrying a bag. And the reason why I'm carrying a bag is that we have benefited greatly from our lecturer over the course of the last 3 nights. But hidden behind that lecturer is a young family who I imagine are missing their dad. And so I don't think they're watching us online, are they, Chris? No. Okay. So look, you'll have to extend. They better be in bed. Or else. And so look, there's actually 4 people that have given us a great gift in terms of Chris being able to be with us here. And inside this bag, I'm not going to pull everything out, are goodies for your family. And please, when you return home, please extend to them our sincere thanks for their generosity in letting us have you over the last few days. The formal part of the process is actually quite nice, really. I'll just get this out and invite Chris. I'm inviting you back up on stage, actually. So each year we actually give our lecturer a medal, and it's a very fine-looking thing. Perhaps if you ask Chris later, he might actually show it to you. But if you'd come up on stage, Chris, I'd like to just, on behalf of New College, all of our friends, our alumni, just to like to say sincere thanks for your great work, and on behalf of that,
thank you so
there is our medal.
Very, very generous. Can I just say that there are 2 little people for whom the 3 lectures were just the warm-up act for whatever's in that bag, and for whom the lectures count for nothing compared to those goodies. So sincerely, thank you so much. That's so kind of you to have made their day.
Very good. To you all, thank you again for being with us this evening and this week. For those of us that are here physically with us, please feel welcome to stay. Belief suppers served next door, the bookstall's next door. Please continue to enjoy our hospitality this evening. I'm reasonably confident Chris would welcome further discussion and questions. I'd love to say come back again tomorrow, but certainly we've reached the end of our 2023 New College Lectures journey. Look, especially for those that are online, please always feel welcome to drop in and see us. Probably during office hours would be most convenient. We love sharing the New College story, how these communities came to be through the blessing of God and the vision of a very small group of evangelical Christians about 60 years ago. It's a great story. It's told in a big blue book. I think there might be some copies on the bookstall, but it's actually amazing how we came to this point, and it should be an encouragement to anybody that's got an idea about how they might serve God. So look, thank you. Thank you for being with us. And all I've got to say to you now is have a very pleasant evening. Good night.